I originally wanted to begin this video with some grand introduction about the impact and legacy of Final Fantasy VII, but I don't really feel like wasting your time with stuff copied off of Wikipedia. If you know what an RPG is, you know that FF7 sold some copies, and then Square noticed that and thought if they did the things that game did again, they could sell some more copies. And while a lot of Square titles from that time just settled for putting Cloud in there, there's 4 games that sincerely try to be in conversation with FF7's ideas in ways that I find interesting. I've been gone for long enough to forget how to do this whole YouTube thing and have to relearn how to write scripts, so make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell, comment your opinions on the games being discussed, and send death threats in the replies of all the other commenters whose opinions you disagree with.
Get mad! Get mad! Get so mad! It drives you mad!
As the earliest release out of the 4 games I'm focusing on, Xenogears differs from the other 3 in how its similarities to FF7 are more so the result of being developed in a similar time span rather than directly responding to the cultural zeitgeist that FF7 would become. Xenogears famously started life as a pitch for Final Fantasy VII that was rejected for being too dark, which inherently means there's going to be a lot of key plot and thematic similarities between the 2 games. Both stories ultimately center around protagonists who have to make sense of complicated identities, be it Cloud confusing part of their past with Zax, or Faye having a trauma-induced case of dissociative identity disorder. These 2 protagonists' identities are explored in very similar ways. Both are out of commission for significant stretches of their respective games so that the player can see them through an outside perspective. Both are opposed by antagonists who exist as reminders of their respective pasts. And both are able to gain a greater understanding of themselves through their relationship with a female lead that culminates in the makers putting in a useless sex scene. Another major similarity between FF7 and Xenogears is in their antagonistic nations of Midgar and Solaris respectively. Both nations are more technologically advanced societies than the rest of their respective worlds, have rigid class structures domestically, and are defined by their exploitation of said worlds for valuable resources. The Shinra Electric Power Company ruling over Midgar extracts Mako energy from the lifestream to generate profits, while Solaris abducts humans from the surface world in order to use them for labor. The main difference between the 2, though, is the perspective we see them from, as FF7 starts out in Midgar before the world eventually opens up, while Xenogears starts out in the surface world and builds up to the party's visit to Solaris at the climax of Disc 1. Midgar's brand of dystopia feels more mundane by virtue of it just being your character's day-to-day life, while Solaris feels more mysterious, this imposing force that you slowly start to understand more and more through the destruction left in its wake. Finally, both FF7 and Xenogears draw attention to the respective parties' use of violence to achieve their goals, asking the question of whether or not their fights are worth it and ultimately concluding with an answer of yes. Barrett is regularly confronted with the consequences of his desire for revenge before eventually concluding that he should continue to fight not for the sake of revenge but for the sake of those he loves. Faye, on the other hand, starts out as a pacifist and develops an even greater opposition to violence as a result of the game's inciting incident where he accidentally destroys his own village in an attempt to defend it from an invading force. Throughout this game's long runtime, Faye has to come to terms with the fact that it is often necessary to fight in order to prevent further harm from happening. Now, Xenogears isn't unique among PS1-era Square games for using ideas that were intended for FF7 at one point. The design of FF8's Adia Kramer was originally intended to appear in FF7, but the game changed so much over the course of development that she eventually had to be cut. And there's also Parasite Eve, which is admittedly a more complex situation due to being a sequel to a pre-existing horror novel that explores the theme of life in a similar manner to FF7. However, the idea of a detective story in New York, a completely different setting from the novel, will sound awfully familiar if you've ever read up on FF7's development history. Though, this begs the question of why I'm centering on the development history of Xenogears but focusing on other aspects of FF8 and skipping over Parasite Eve entirely. Well, to put it simply, this connection to FF7's development history is more relevant to what I find so resonant about Xenogears. The prevailing narrative surrounding Xenogears is one of ambition, that of a game bold enough to explore many different high concepts such as Jungian psychology, Nietzschean philosophy, and Gnostic religion, and do so as just one part of its planned 6-part saga. So discussion of Xenogears usually focuses on this idea of ambition, either in how this ambition was successfully achieved as some sort of perfectly planned work by supposed genius auteur Tetsuya Takahashi, or in how the game failed to achieve its lofty goals due to the circumstances of its development infamously forcing Corner to be cut for Disc 2. But I would argue that the manner in which Xenogears failed to deliver on this ambition is far more interesting than whatever the fully realized version of it would have looked like. The messiness of Xenogears as a result of its tumultuous development history really just ends up furthering the game's central thesis of the imperfect nature of humanity. The many issues in its script, be it ones that existed as a result of complications of localization or ones that were there in the Japanese version to begin with, give dialogue a very unfiltered quality. The mind-numbing combat and extremely intrusive rate of random encounters help you get into the headspace of a pacifist constantly being forced into combat. And the abrupt shift that Disc 2 represents gives off this feeling of having gone through so much shit that you now see each horrible occurrence as yet another bullet point. Everything about Xenogears reminds me of vent art, and I mean it as a genuine compliment. It exists to say anything and everything buried within the darkest corners of its mind, regardless of how well articulated the thought in question is, or how good of an idea it is to put it out there. So having Final Fantasy VII, a game with infinitely more consideration in both its mechanical design and pacing, as a very easy point of comparison helps to emphasize this unrestrained quality of Xenogears. Xenogears ultimately feels like a mere first draft to FF7, but as it says, it's okay not to feel all.
So if you're not a fan of the words, peak fiction.
Since Final Fantasy VIII is ultimately a character study of its protagonist, the easiest point to begin with and then work our way from is with how Squall is largely playing off the same image of a stoic loner that Cloud is, with one key difference. Cloud's character arc is about the struggle to live up to the image of success in a capitalist society, as their issues with understanding their own identity exist as a result of comparisons to characters like Zack and Sephiroth, who serve as model workers in the same occupation. In contrast, Squall is someone who is successfully recruited by a special mercenary force, not unlike the soldier title Cloud strives for, and even got promoted to a leadership role in Disc 2. And so, FF8 is ultimately a story about obtaining the kind of success under capitalism that Cloud chased after, but still feeling dissatisfied in spite of that. The thing that's crucial to understanding Final Fantasy VIII, but is criminally under-discussed in conversations surrounding it, is the fact that it's Marxist. And I don't mean this in a hyping up something made for children as some uniquely progressive entity way. I mean this as in one of FF8's core concepts is literally something taken from Marx's writings. Time compression, the manner in which main antagonist Ultimecia seeks to take control of the world, is based on an idea called time-space compression from David Harvey's A Condition of Postmodernity that's elaborating on an idea from Marx's Grundrisse called the annihilation of space-time. The gist of time-space compression is that it describes how both political and technological revolutions resulted in the insecurities of a shifting relative space in which events in one place could have immediate and ramifying effects in several other places. Or in other words, people's mental perception of time is accelerating as a result of transportation and similar other pieces of technology decreasing the effective distance from place to place, and it feels like you're rushing through events faster. Both the political and the technological components of time-space compression can be seen within FF8. 8's world is marked by a great deal of political instability that stems from the relatively recent Source of War, and the game regularly makes mention of the internet, something that was still a somewhat new technology at the time of its release. The point of this whole spiel is that the emotional core of FF8 is in how capitalism erodes the social aspect of life. A lot of schools' internal issues exist because they have this shut up and get the job done mentality and exclusively process their social interactions in the context of capitalist obligations like school or work. Look no further than how a lot of their Disc 1 interactions with Rinoa are colored by just seeing her as an employer in a way that creates distance between the two of them. This is paralleled against Saphir, whose romantic dream of becoming a knight to a queen is a similar conflation of personal relationships with capitalist obligations to Squall's. But while Squall is eventually able to have meaningful platonic friendships and a fulfilling romantic relationship with Rinoa, Saphir's role as Ultimecia's knight ruins his friendships with Fushin and Raijin, as well as his former relationship with the same girl. This general similarity of FF7 and FF8 both being about capitalism is accompanied by more direct points of conversation between the two games. For example, FF8's gunblades are a clear attempt to recapture the iconic image of Cloud's Buster Sword. However, while the Buster Sword is a one-of-a-kind weapon in-universe that was inherited by Cloud from Zack, the gunblade is an object of mass production that you can just go to a store and buy, with many people in Balam Garden talking about it like it's a toy. The gunblade isn't a symbol of some unique personal connection, it's a commodity. The epitome of the side of the gunblade is Saphir's relationship with it, as his romantic dream was formed by him watching a movie where Laguna played a knight wielding the same model of gunblade that he would eventually go on to use. It's easy to see this as a parallel to Zack's passing down of the Buster Sword to Cloud, as both Zack and Laguna are characters who exist as a primary lens through which some mysterious past is seen, and both had a distorted version of their ideals passed down to another major character through a sword. The important distinction between these two, though, though, is that Safer's relationship with Laguna is more parasocial in nature as opposed to Cloud's relationship with Zack. For as much of a one-sided element that there was to that dynamic, they still actually knew of each other's existence, and the taking of the Buster Sword was a physical action that happened. In comparison, Laguna has never once actually interacted with Safer or even so much as acknowledged its existence. Another part of FF7 that FF8 plays with is the time limit that defines the opening bombing mission. 8 has multiple sections with a time limit that you have a choice over, undercutting a lot of the excitement that these kinds of escape sequences usually aim to provide. You're never in any real danger because you can always just pick the easiest time. The very first of these sequences within FF8 is even framed as a test in an academic setting, further contributing to this feeling of mundanity. And while this is more so playing with the conventions of RPGs in general than anything specific to FF7, 8's approaches to enemy levels and its in-game currency are both similar attempts to distort the fantastical into the mundane. Enemy levels infamously scale to your party's levels in such a way that leveling up can be more beneficial to your opponents than it is to you. Enemies also don't yield any money, which is instead earned through wages paid at periodic intervals. If you try to solve your problems by mindlessly grinding, your hard work will be for nothing and you might even be in a worse place than where you started. Finally, there's FF8's junction system, which is once again an attempt to recapture a signature aspect of FF7, this time the materia system. 8 has you junctioning spells to your character's stats in a similar manner to how 7 has you equipping materia to your character's equipment. But unlike 7's materia, or even just the typical MP system, spells are consumable in the same way as potions, and you regularly have to stock up on them. This is similar to Gunblades in the way that it demystifies the staple of RPGs and turns it into a basic commodity, something that's further aided by the optimal method of getting spells involving collectible trading cards. Additionally, 7's materia system is often described as an everyone-can-do-everything system in which there are few mechanical differences between individual party members due to most of your options being tied to universal equips. 8's junction system also follows that design philosophy, but in a narrative context where that lack of individuality is just what a party largely consisting of members of the same military academy who are made to conform into the same role is naturally going to be like. The broader point I'm making with all these seemingly disconnected observations is that all throughout Final Fantasy VIII there is a juxtaposition between the real and the surreal. Characters have realistic proportions as far as PS single hardware is concerned, mechanics like salary payments and the updated weapon system seek to make the world feel more grounded, and the game's aesthetics generally take more from our contemporary world than any prior Final Fantasy game. But that just makes the many bizarre plot points throughout 8's runtime stick out more, especially in the final act where compressed time lends itself to loads of surrealist imagery. And one of FF8's main tools for conveying this juxtaposition is through the way it plays with signature aspects of not just FF7 but the genre as a whole. Swords and spells are reduced to basic commodities. Enemy scaling reveals the promise of overcoming any obstacle by training hard enough to be a farce. A character who takes a lot from both the then recent Cloud Strife and the paladins of classic Final Fantasy, with Gilgamesh even mistaking him for parts in the Japanese version, is an antagonist driven by delusions of grandeur. And while FF8 is not the first FF to stray from using the series' signature baseline in its normal battle theme, the decision to incorporate it into Darude Sandstorm, the name of the song that plays during the last phase of the final battle, accentuates its absence and makes Ultimecia into a uniquely fantastical entity within the game's world. Final Fantasy VIII distorts RPG conventions in such a way that its commentary on how capitalism erodes social life also includes attempts to distract from it through escapist fantasies. In other words, FF8 says to go outside.
Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live.
Chrono Trigger is a very uncontroversial choice for greatest game of all time, and a game that YouTubers who hate RPGs can play at a young enough age to see as one of the only good ones, which is what makes Chrono Cross such a fascinating follow-up. Trigger says that humanity will always prevail without opening up much room for debate. Cross interrogates the pros and cons of that philosophy by exploring the negative ramifications of the decision to rewrite history that defines its predecessor. And while Cross does ultimately end on a note that affirms Trigger's positive outlook on humanity, debating about whether or not the characters in the only good game ever made actually secretly ruined everything is going to ruffle a few feathers. This is accompanied by what I would consider to be the single funniest piece of RPG discourse of all time, in which a joke villain from Trigger is implied to have successfully taken over Chrono's home country without actually appearing in the game, and Reddit power scalers haven't forgiven Cross for that since.
Sorry, Chrono fans, I know you all really wanted to win, but unfortunately, this wasn't it.
But for as much as Chrono Cross is shaped by its relationship with Trigger, I would argue that it's also in conversation with Final Fantasy VII, albeit in more understated ways. Like Xenogears, Chrono Cross shares its focus on trying to understand its protagonist's complicated identity with FF7. Surge is an anomaly, someone who was fated to die as a child and did so in every timeline except the one that the game starts in but miraculously survived. Cross once again explores its protagonist's identity through their relationship with a female lead and through a significant chunk of the game where said protagonist, or just their body this time, is is out of commission due to getting possessed by a Panther supercomputer who is also their dad. Link/Dark Surge in particular is one of the largest connections between FF7 and Chrono Cross as an antagonistic figure who serves as this ghostly reminder of Surge's past in much the same way that Sephiroth does for Cloud. While Graf fills this role for Faye to some extent, his G-Gundam mass, parentheses complementary, doesn't feel as spectral as both Sephiroth and Dark Surge do, floating around, existing beyond a physical form, and generally feeling like a phantom. Additionally, a prevailing aspect of Cloud's dynamic with Sephiroth is this sense of dread that the former could end up hurting those closest to them due to their connection with the latter, as embodied by Cloud's fear of hurting Aerith. Though she thankfully famously survives the events of FF7. Chrono Cross invokes these fears from the very start, as the game opens with a flash forward that ends with kids seemingly getting killed by Surge. But an area where Chrono Cross stands out even more in regards to its FF7 influences is in its battle mechanics. Chrono Cross's element system is clearly a response to 7's materia system in a similar vein to 8's junction system. Both serve the gameplay role of equipable items that you use to gain access to spells and represent natural resources that the party and enemies alike are making use of. However, Chrono Cross goes even further on that latter point, as unlike materia, which doesn't put any limits on how many spells you can cast provided you have enough MP, each equipped element's corresponding spell can only be used once per battle. On top of adding a lot of strategic implications and resulting in what I would consider to be one of the most engaging RPG battle systems ever created, this makes elements feel more like the natural resources they exist as in the game's world. Things you can only use so much of before you run out, especially in comparison to 7's traditional MP system. What I'm getting at with this comparison is that Chrono Cross is informed by the environmental side of Final Fantasy VII. As I touched upon in the Xenogears segment, Shinra's exploitation of the Lifestream is a key plot point within FF7, and the game concludes with a battle between Aerith's Holy Magic and Sephiroth's Meteor where the former is able to prevail even if Midgar is destroyed in the process, before cutting to a final shot of Red 13 running across a now healed planet years later. What's so fascinating about this final shot though is how it doesn't specify whether or not humanity still exists in this new future, as if to ask whether or not we as a species have truly earned the right to do so. Chrono Cross exists to answer that question. Humanity's potential to do harm is a regular point of focus within Chrono Cross. Early on in the game, a fantasy race of dwarves loses their home to humanity's or potentially Surge's actions, which causes a chain reaction in which another fantasy race's home is attacked as well. And as things unravel, you begin to find out about even larger scale failings of humanity. Like how Chrono's defeat of Lavos only ended up making it strong enough to threaten every timeline, or how the Guru Belphazar's attempts to stop its new threat similarly ended up allowing the supercomputer Fate to fully take control of the world. Most damning of all, humanity is casually revealed to have only been able to evolve due to the actions of Lavos and described in a similar light to said parasitic being by both itself and the Dragon God. But Chrono Cross is about proving this Malthusian philosophy of humanity inherently being destructive wrong, and its mechanics reinforce this. It is very easy to maneuver around enemies on the map, and due to EXP being reformatted in such a way that you can't just mindlessly grind, it's often optimal to not get into fights. Similarly, unlike most RPGs, Chrono Cross gives you the option to run from even bosses, so even if you ultimately have to go back to fighting the boss, there will always be a reminder that violence is something we choose to get into. And this form of mechanical storytelling reaches its natural conclusion in the final boss, where reducing its HP to 0 only causes it to retreat, so you instead need to find a way to actively reject violence. You're then given a speech that starts out by questioning the supposed inevitability of violence before eventually ending on the uplifting note that every individual life, no matter how seemingly insignificant, has a purpose. This speech has an added layer of meaning when you remember that one of the main points of discussion surrounding Chrono Cross is its large cast, with 45 playable characters in total, compared to Final Fantasy where the largest cast consists of only 14 characters. As you'd expect from a cast that large, a lot of characters within it are severely undeveloped. But when you think back to the ending, everything makes sense. You're supposed to feel insignificant, especially in comparison to the large-scale events of the game, but still contribute something regardless. And that feeling of insignificance is that same feeling that drove Cloud's identity crisis. So in addition to being an answer to the question asked by FF7's ending, Chrono Cross is a reassurance that no matter how small your existence seems in the grand scheme of things, you have something to contribute. Even in cases like the circumstances in which Lavos allowed humans to exist, or Surge's existence inherently undoing Chrono Trigger's happy ending, Chrono Cross fully believes you can be a positive presence on the world. Yes, you specifically, because the end credits go out of their way to show live action footage as this call to action that you have your own person to meet and improve the life of out there. The game points right at you, says life is worth living, and makes you have to give it 5 stars on Backlogged.
Oh, by the way, If Square doesn't add voiceovers to Final Fantasy IX, I'm committed.
While Xenogears is a vague rough draft of FF7 and the other two stories I discussed thus far are attempts to further lean into key aspects of that game, Final Fantasy IX is defined by how it contrasts with 7 and 8. A versus 7, if you will. As the last single-digit Final Fantasy, FF9 was intended to be a series watershed, a sort of grand collection of what has come before. Rather than 8's more realistic graphics for the time, 9 has a more vibrant color scheme, gives its characters more exaggerated proportions, and generally leans into the cartoonier look that sprite-based FF's adopted. FF9 also leans more into the medieval fantasy settings associated with the supposed classic era as opposed to 7 or 8's more contemporary aesthetics. Additionally, 9's party members are given more defined roles than those of the everyone can do everything systems of 7 and 8. And to mirror that, each of them takes several design cues from a classic Final Fantasy job, with the most on the nose of the bunch being Vivi's resemblance to the FF1 Black Mage. A particularly big point of divergence between 9 and the two games that preceded is its protagonist. Zidane is more outgoing and outwardly cheery than the image of a stoic loner associated with Cloud or Squall. But what's particularly interesting about this area of contrast is how Zidane's backstory of secretly being created as a tool to absorb a planet's energy before eventually suffering from amnesia is a vaguely similar setup to the likes of Cloud, Faye, or Surge. Yet in comparison to those characters whose journeys are defined by active attempts to understand their past, Zidane isn't quite as concerned with that. Or at least not at the point the game starts from. In a conversation with Garnet, Zidane describes the journey he went on prior to the events of the game to find the blue light that served as the only memory of his birthplace before eventually turning up nothing. The conclusion that he came to is that while he would like to find his birthplace one day, he's pretty content with his adoptive home. Especially in contrast to Vivi, who hasn't quite found a place to belong yet, and whose story is about trying to understand themselves in the way that the aforementioned protagonist did. So the game's final act, where Zidane learns about his connections to Garland, Kuja, and the planet of Terra, ends up being contextualized as something unexpectedly thrust upon him rather than something he was deliberately searching for. While Cloud coming to terms with their true self is what allows them to gain a feeling of release from their issues, Zidane learning about his true self ends up being the source of new issues that have to be resolved in the You're Not Alone scene. But the thing with FF9 is that references to other games in the series are just a core part of its identity. Many things within 9 are named after things from past games. 1's Garland and the Four Fiends, 2's Pandemonium Castles, 3's Invincible, 5's Grand Cross, etc. Trances, 9's equivalent to limit breaks, are based on a mechanic exclusive to Terra and FF6. The normal battle theme once again uses the series' signature bassline, and the looping portion of the victory fanfare goes back to the melody used from 1 to 6. Furthermore, Kuja, the game's primary antagonist, shares many similarities to past antagonists. Him and Zidane's dynamic of an evil older brother and a good younger brother who hail from another planet harkens back to Golbez and Cecil from FF4. His decision to usurp his superior in order to enact a plot to destroy the world is reminiscent of FF6's Kefka Palazzo. And most relevant to 9's broader themes, Kuja being motivated out of an inability to process his own mortality is a pretty clear nod to the Sorcerer Zonde from FF3, complete with a stronger and more abstract entity overtaking him as the real final boss after his defeat. Final Fantasy IX is a game about coming to terms with your own mortality and making the most of your life with the knowledge that you will die one day. The motivations of the game's antagonists generally end up having some fixation on the idea of death, whether it's Kuja's existential crisis, Garland's desire to keep his planet alive forever, or Necron's desire to fulfill what it perceives as humanity's desire for non-existence. The playable cast, on the other hand, have their own experiences with death that they are successfully able to move on from and become stronger people because of. Garnet steps up as a ruler in the wake of her mother's death. Vivi comes to terms with their shorter lifespan and manages to have 7 children before they die. And Amarin, also known as the character who hating makes you weak, joins the party in a state where he wouldn't really care if Zidane killed him, but eventually takes his first steps on the path to finding a purpose in life. What adds an extra dimension to the central theme of Final Fantasy IX, though, is when you remember the game's place in the series' history. FF7 had become a unique cultural zeitgeist as far as RPGs are concerned, and the series was essentially going to change because of that. So at some point, it clicks that FF9's focus on accepting death also includes accepting the death of the classic era, as highlighted by how heavily it references the games of that era. FF8, a game developed around the same time span as 9, represents the future and how much of its theming is tied to the rise of the internet and how it doubles down on changes made by 7 as a vision for what a new era of Final Fantasy would look like. FF9 is the opposite, a game representing the past with how heavily it invokes medieval fantasy aesthetics and in how it serves as one final send-off to the classic era. If you asked me to point to one reason as to why Final Fantasy VII still resonates so deeply with people to this very day, it's how the character dynamic between Cloud and Zack mirrors the relationship between player and character, projecting onto this stronger, more masculine hero to use as a form of escapism. So when someone plays FF7 for the power fantasy aspect of badass sword guy and Claude reveals himself to be a more vulnerable person than what you'd assume from just the box art, it's easy to have a more personal connection to the game. Claude is a character that people from all walks of life are able to connect to, with queer and neurodivergent interpretations of them being particularly common. And that's because the insecurities they feel are universal and malleable enough that your takeaway can be anything from "it's okay not to feel whole" to "I'm not alone." I think that's why Square's PS1 era output just clicked so much with me. They're games that aim to be more than just something to get addicted to give you something to bring into your day-to-day life. I'll never forget the 9-month stretch of time where I first played through Final Fantasy VII because it coincided with a lot of big things for me. Taking the first step in exploring my sexuality by realizing I'm ace, becoming more confident in my abilities as a creator, and starting to talk with some of my first online friends. I'll also never forget my playthrough of Final Fantasy VIII back in March of last year because that juxtaposition between internal thoughts and outward expression the game is conveying through Squall is the most I felt emotionally understood by a work of art, so it just is my favorite game now. And I'll never forget my playthrough of Xenogears, a game I played for the sake of this video and didn't expect to like that much before it ended up being a way to process a lot of things both online and IRL that happened to me around the time. All I'll say is that Black Moon Forest really leaves an impact on you when you play it sometime after one of the worst periods of a certain type of ideation you already experience passively on a daily basis. No need to worry for me though, I'm in a better state mentally now. I finished the script for this around the time of my channel's 5-year anniversary, and a lot has changed in that period of time. I graduated college and have held down a job for 2 years. I have a better understanding of who I am, and now I wouldn't even call myself a man. And truth be told, I don't even see myself as a dedicated YouTuber anymore, just an internet user who incidentally happens to make videos from time to time. Thanks for sticking with me, and sorry for the over 4-month wait. It will happen again. I'm not quite ready to quit yet, but it's only a matter of time before I move on to other creative endeavors, maybe even making my own game. I guess what this whole ramble is getting at is that things change, and PS1 era Square games are about that. All the games I talked about in this video exist as a reflection of a bunch of big changes. The technology with which these things are being made, the material circumstances of Square as a company, and even something as silly as the first digit you enter when you're typing up the year. And this weird transitional point just resonated with me in all the right ways.